Today, we'll be going over Chapter 8, which is all about lists. So, let's get started. First off, congratulations on reaching the last chapter in the advanced section. By the end of this lesson, you'll have learned basically everything you need to know to start coding in Scratch. So, let's get right into it. This lesson is an extension of what we learned in Chapter 6, and it'll complete our coverage of the variables category. While we were working on the programs in that chapter, you may have seen a button at the bottom of the category that says Make a List. This lesson will go over what you can do with that button and how to use lists well. But before we start making a list, you should understand what a list is. A list is exactly what it sounds like, just a list of something. The something in this case can be numbers or text. A list allows you to store multiple values in one location and then access them from that list by their location in the list or access their location by knowing their value. And though it seems simple when you think about it at first, it can be confusing when you actually use them in code. So let's go through everything you can do with lists one by one. So to start off, let's make a new project by going to the home page and clicking create. And once this new project loads up, let's rename it lists so that we can always come back to understand how lists work. Then let's go to the variables category, which is the second to last category on the very left. And so to practice using a list, you have to first create a list. So let's click the button, make a list, and it's going to bring up a box that looks like this, which is very similar to the one that we used when we were creating variables. So to make the lesson more understandable, we're going to use a list to represent something that you might actually use in a Scratch project, which is to represent the health of different characters. So let's name the list something like health or HP so that it's clear what the list represents. So let's click OK to create the list. And then once you create the list, more blocks should appear in the variables category, and then a smaller box with the title and where the values will be stored should appear in the top left of the stage. So just like with the variables, this box in the stage will eventually show all the variables that are in the list. So now let's look back at the code storage and let's start looking at all these blocks that appeared. So the first block that shows up is this little round block that represents all of the values in the list, just like when we saw when we were working with variables, a block that represents the value of the variable. So this little check marks right next to it does the same thing as the other check marks did, so clicking this small box will make that box in the stage appear or disappear. So let's leave it as it is with the blue check mark so that the box does appear, because we want to be able to see all the values while we're working with them. And these last two list blocks at the bottom will do the same thing. They'll show or hide the list. And we're not going to go over them explicitly because they work the same as the blocks that we covered in Chapter 6. So then the rest of the blocks are more functional, and they'll deal with the values that are stored inside the list. So then the first main block is the add thing to health block. This block will just add an entry to the list with a value of thing. This value can be changed to whatever you like, whether it be numbers or text. Since our example has to do with health, we're going to be using numbers in this list so that the value can be easily modified by the program to reflect certain changes in the game. So let's drag one of these blocks, these add thing to health block, to the code area, and let's go to the events category and drag a when green flag clicked on top of it. And now let's click where it says thing, and let's type in 100, so as that will be our first value to add to health. And the code should look something like this, just with the when green flag clicked and then the add 100 to health block. And then let's run the program. And you'll see that a new entry is added to the list. It's labeled as 1, which is this number to the left, and then the value is written next to it in this small orange box. Now let's change the value in the code to something else. For example, I'll change it to 200. And let's run the program again. And you'll see this time it just adds it to the bottom. A new value with a label of 2 instead, and then the box with the value of 200 is right next to that. So then let's do it again with the third value. To keep it simple, I'll just make it 300. And when we do it again, now we have a list of 3 items, each with labels 1, 2, and 3. And then they each have their own values stored at each location. So congratulations, you've just created your first list in Scratch. So also, unfortunately, just to note, the only labels for values in lists are these numbers 1, 2, and 3. So you're going to have to keep track of what each value applies to separately. So then, in addition to the add block, Scratch also provides a second, more precise way to add values to a list. So for now, let's remove this add block by clicking it and dragging it back to the code area, and let's go back to the variables category. Then, let's find insert thing at 1 of health, and let's drag it underneath the when green flag clicked block. So, like you might guess, this block will add a value at a specific location in the list instead of just adding it onto the bottom. And then the number that's in the block will be the label for the value that we add, and the values that's currently at that location and below will just be pushed down one more label down. So to see this in action, because that can be a little confusing just trying to think about it, let's change the value to a number that's completely different from the list. For example, let's change thing to 375, so nothing close to 100, 200, or even 300. And you'll be able to clearly tell when that number changes. So then let's change this 1 to a 2 so we can make sure that it's being added somewhere in the middle of the list so we can see it, so that the code looks something like this, with a when green flag clicked, then insert 375 at 2 of health. So now let's run the program, and you'll see that the value appears actually as the second list item, and then the other variables will just move down. So for now, let's just delete this block because we're going to move on to the next set of blocks. So now you understand how to add values to the list, but what if you added a value that you don't want? Or what if you later realize that you didn't need a certain value in the list? Well, Scratch provides a few ways to delete values from a list. The first method is to delete values from a list manually. So if you go to the box where the values are stored and then you click on any of the specific values, you'll see that it brings up an option to manually alter the value. Then it also brings up this little X to the right, and if you click that, it'll just delete the value from the list. Then the second method is with a code, and it uses the block delete 1 of health, which deletes a value from the list using its number label. So let's drag one of these blocks under the when green flag click block. So for example, if we wanted to delete the second value of the list, you would change that number from a 1 to a 2. And then if we run that program, we'll see that that second value that we added, that 375, will disappear, and then the other values will just move up to take its place. So sometimes you'll actually just know the value and not the label, and that's common if you can't actually see the list. So you can actually use one of the provided round blocks, which is item number of thing in health, which is this one right here. And basically, if you know the value, you can replace where it says thing, and then it'll give you the label number for that value. So you can take this block and drag it in where we had typed in 2, and this, with this value substituted for whatever it is, it would delete any of those from the list. So if we change it to 75, obviously nothing happened because none of our values are 75. But if there were any entries with a value of 75, they would be deleted from the list. So then the third and final method is this delete all of health block right here. And this block is pretty dangerous because it'll just delete all of the values from this list. And sometimes this can have its uses, but you should be careful with this block. So now the last normal block in the rest of this section is this block replace item 1 of health with thing. And this block essentially combines two blocks into one. It will first delete the block at a certain value, and then it'll insert a new value at that same label of the list. So for now, let's delete any blocks that were under the when green flag clicked block, and then let's drag this replace block underneath the when green flag clicked. Then let's change this 1 to a 2, and then let's change this thing to a new value that's different than the value that's already at 2. So I'm going to just do something completely random like 57. And then, so let's run this code, and you'll see that the value at 2 is just changed automatically without the rest of the list changing. So note that just like the delete block from before, you can actually use this second round block, this item number of thing in health, to replace a certain value with another value. So before we talk about other applications of lists, let's finish covering the rest of these blocks. This first round block, item 1 of health, will let you access the value at a certain label of the list so that you can use it in a different code block. Then the second one is the one we've been talking about so far, and it'll let you find the label number of a given value. Then the third round block, length of health, gives you the count. So you'll see that there's 3 values here, and the length is equal to 3. Then the last block to cover is this pointed block at the bottom, health contains thing ? Which lets you check if a certain value is in the list as a condition for an if-then block. Now, this is just a quick overview of all the functions of lists. So before we finish this chapter and this part, let's go over some applications of lists and the associated blocks. So with our use of a list to represent the healths of characters, you can use the replace block with an operator block and the first round block to change the health values of certain characters. So for example, if we say that label 1 and whatever values are there represents the health of character 1, then let's see what we can do using this replace block. So let's drag this replace block here if you somehow got rid of it before. Then let's go to the operators category, and let's drag the second block, this blank minus block blank, into the code area. Then let's go back to the variables category, and let's look for item 1 of health. And then we're going to take this block and drag it into the left hole of the operator block, waiting for that white highlight to appear. And then in the right hole of the operator block, let's put something like small, like 5. And now we're going to drag this entire thing by clicking the minus sign to drag the entire operator block. And then we're going to replace the value we had typed in before, which I put as 57. We're going to drag it until we see that white highlight appear, and then let go. And then the last thing we need to do is change this 2 for item 2 to item 1. So now the code should look like something like this, where it's when green flag clicked, replace item 1 of health with item 1 of health minus 5. So you can see that this is going to just decrease the value of item 1 by 5 every time you run the program. And this code is essentially showing that character 1 that we described before is taking some damage. So it can come in handy later when you're making some programs in Scratch and games too. So just remember, this is just one of many applications of lists. Lists can be a very powerful tool in your different Scratch projects. And they can be intimidating when you try to use them, but trying to incorporate them in different projects and slowly using them and getting used to them will help you slowly understand all of the different uses and just how powerful they can be. The more we try to apply concepts and different code blocks that we don't understand, the better that we'll start to learn understanding programming in Scratch. So, with that in mind, let's move on to the next part, where we'll be applying a lot of the concepts we've already covered in this book.